Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. A couple of professors at the University of Iowa just presented their climate prophecies. Senator Hogg from Iowa tweeted this morning. University of Iowa professors Peter Thorne and Jerry Schnorr urge Iowans to reduce fossil fuel pollution, prepare for more dangerous heat waves that threaten people and animals as they release latest Iowa scientist statement on climate change at Cedar Rapids Library. If you look at their poster, you'll see it says, Iowa will be hotter with more 90-degree days per year. That's pretty definitive, no uncertainty there. Here's a close-up. Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research. Iowa Climate Statement 2019. Dangerous heat events will be more frequent and severe. Iowa will be hotter with more 90-degree days per year. The great American physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said, if he thought science was certain, well, that was just an error on your part. I've studied Iowa climate quite a bit, and I know that the National Climate Assessment shows that peak temperatures in Iowa have plummeted over the last 60 years. This chart from the National Climate Assessment shows the change in warmest temperature of the year, 1986 to 2016 average minus 1901 to 1960 average. Iowa is just about the fastest cooling place in the country. Peak temperatures there are down 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Peak temperatures are declining in most of the country, but particularly in the upper Midwest. This graph shows the average daily maximum temperature at all Iowa United States Historical Climatology Network stations for the past century. Maximum temperatures in Iowa have been declining steadily for the past century and are down nearly 2 degrees from 100 years ago. The hottest year in Iowa was 1931, where they had an average maximum temperature of 64 degrees. Recent years have been among the coolest on record. This next graph shows the average percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit at all Iowa United States Historical Climatology Network stations. The frequency of 90-degree days in Iowa has dropped about 2/3 since the 1930s. So why are these professors saying Iowa will be hotter with more 90-degree days per year? There's no historical evidence to support that idea. I exchanged emails with one of them, and he told me they were aware of the fact that the frequency of 90-degree days had dropped in Iowa, and he said that they mentioned that in their press conference. He said the basis of their claims was climate models used in the National Climate Assessment. The climate models are written around the idea that increased carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere will produce more hot days. But the frequency of hot days in Iowa has plummeted as CO2 levels have increased. This graph shows the percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit on the y-axis, and along the x-axis is increasing CO2 concentrations from left to right. Atmospheric CO2 has gone up from about 300 parts per million to over 400 parts per million over the last century. But as the amount of CO2 has increased in the atmosphere, the frequency of hot days in Iowa has dropped by more than 1/2. This shows us unequivocally that the climate models don't work. If they can't explain the past, they certainly aren't going to be able to predict the future. There's no reason to believe that this trend will not continue on the same path it's been going on over the past century. This next graph shows the peak temperatures in Iowa for every year going back to 1893. You can see that peak temperatures in Iowa have dropped sharply over the last 120 years, and particularly over the last 80 years. Temperatures over 110 degrees were quite common in Iowa prior to 1940, and in 1936 they reached an incredible 117 degrees. But now Iowa rarely gets above even 100 degrees. This graph shows the number of 100-degree days recorded in Iowa for every year going back to 1893. As you can see, prior to 60 years ago, 100-degree days were much more common, but they're very rare now. During 1913, 1934, and 1936, Iowa recorded more than 40 days over 100 degrees. But now Iowa typically records either 0 or 1 day above 100 degrees per year. This graph is a little different. It shows the number of 100-degree temperature readings recorded at all Iowa United States Historical Climatology Network stations for every year. So say you had 10 stations recording on the same day temperatures over 100 degrees, they'd all get counted. During the record hot summer of 1936, more than 500 100-degree temperature readings were recorded in Iowa. The worst heat wave on record in Iowa occurred at Logan from June 16, 1936 to September 6, 1936. The average temperature at Logan during that almost 3-month period was an incredible 98 degrees. To put that in perspective, the hottest temperature in Logan this summer was 96 degrees. So the hottest temperature this year was lower than the average during 1936. That's an amazing statistic which shows just how much Iowa's cooled down over the last 80 years. Here's some headlines from Iowa papers during the summer of 1936. Des Moines Register, 35 die in Iowa, mercury at 115 degrees. The Daily Times, Wednesday, July 8, 1936. Pleasant Valley onion harvest opens amid record heat. Field workers swelter in temperature of 120 degrees. Drought curtails crop 20% and speeds maturity. Cedar Rapids Gazette. City gasps in record heat. Expected hot weather relief fails to reach Iowa. 113 degrees today, highest in 22 years of records. Now let's look at the professors who are making these prophecies. Peter S. Thorne, Department, Occupational and Environmental Health. Well, that doesn't sound like climate science. Gerald L. Schnorr, Professor, Civil and Environmental Engineering. That doesn't sound like climate science either. And then, Peter Thorne, communicating the best available science. These two men are not communicating science at all. They're simply telling prophecies. Prophecies made from climate models which show zero skill and in fact predict the exact opposite of what's been occurring. What the data shows is that the frequency of 90-degree days in Iowa has plummeted over the last century. It's down about 2/3. There's no reason to believe that they will increase in the future. Their entire prediction was based on climate models which don't work. Climate models would have predicted an increase in the number of 90-degree days as CO2 increased over the last century, but the opposite has occurred, so the climate models are broken and worthless. The same group of Iowa ambulance chasers has been at it for a long time. Here's an article about the same group from 2012. Iowa scientists, drought a sign of climate change, Associated Press, November 20th, 2012. Des Moines, Iowa. This year's drought is consistent with predictions that global climate change will bring about weather extremes, including more frequent droughts, said a report released Monday. The Iowa Climate Statement updates the 2010 report, reflecting the year's lingering drought and the belief that it signifies what many scientists have predicted. Increasing instability in weather patterns will lead to extremes during both wet and dry years. Now let's look at the actual drought history for Iowa from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This is the Palmer Drought Severity Index for Iowa. Green means wetter, brown means drier. It means drought. That prediction was made during the drought of 2012, but as you can see, drought has become less common in Iowa, not more common. Like in the 1930s, Iowa was in drought most of the time, similar in the 1950s, but in recent years they've been having much less drought than Iowa used to have. And the other thing to notice is that weather patterns have always been very unstable, alternating rapidly between wet periods and dry periods. They used to happen more frequently than they do now. The climate has actually become more stable in Iowa. I don't see any indication that this group of Iowa academics has any predictive skill. They seem to be just ambulance chasers playing on people's fears. This group is trying to influence policy with unsupportable junk science. This is exactly what President Eisenhower warned about in his farewell speech 60 years ago, back in the days when Iowa actually was really hot. The president said, "In holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite." That's what these professors are attempting to do with their fear-mongering. They got the senator's attention. When people declare unsupportable certainty in science, all they're doing is destroying the reputation and integrity of science. How is the public going to feel about science when none of these prophecies of doom come to pass? And there's no reason to believe that Iowans have control either over the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or the climate. China is building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants, one every 2 weeks. Iowa could drop off the map entirely and it wouldn't make a significant difference to the global CO2 budget. I come from a science and engineering world where everything has to be perfect or people will die. But academics have a different perspective. They seem to feel like they can just make things up and get away with it. Climate models are not reality. Their forecasts for Iowa go against the trend. They show zero skill at predicting Iowa's past and certainly won't be able to predict Iowa's future. The fact that other academics make the same mistake of conflating climate models with reality doesn't make the mistake any less egregious. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.